No one is claiming that only Peter is the rock. It is typically Protestants who claim Peter is not or cannot be the rock. The Catechism of the Catholic Church acknowledges that the rock in Matthew 16 is both Peter and his faith, as many fathers do. Paragraphs 552 and 881 affirm Peter to be the rock of the church. But paragraph 424 also affirms that Peter's confession of faith is also the rock on which the church is built. Following many of the early church fathers, Catholicism embraces both interpretations. Here is a quick visual summary of the rest of this video presentation, starting from the earliest interpreter of the Matthew 16 rock, namely Tertullian in the 2nd century, and ending with the 4th Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon in the 5th century. This visual chart speaks for itself, I think. No early church father or writer ultimately denied that Peter was the rock. Perhaps the closest person to do that was Augustine, but we will see that he was open to both interpretations at the end of his life. What do you think of my chart? I did my best to be thorough, but it may not be perfect. Do you wish to challenge its accuracy? Let me know down in the comment section. Perhaps more check marks could be added to the far right non-Petrine column, but that wouldn't impact or defeat the Catholic claim, since I will be providing the citations where they identify Peter also as the rock. I was reading through some materials on Steve Ray's website, and he claims that this idea of the rock being Peter's confession of Christ's divine status as the Son of the living God, that this idea became a popular rhetorical point against Arianism. And so that would be the reason why we find this so common in the early fathers. Now, I'm not sure how true that is, since there seem to be other, perhaps more decisive passages, anti-Arian passages that the early fathers used, but you can take that for whatever it's worth. Origen is famous for his multiple and allegorical interpretations of Scripture, so it is no surprise that one of his interpretations of Matthew 16:18 would allegorize it to all believers. We see this in his own commentary on Matthew, when he says, "We too can be like Peter or become a Peter." But even these allegorical interpretations would make no sense unless there was a already widespread understanding that the primary literal interpretation of the Matthew 16 rock is Peter. At the very least, it should be very clear that Origen did not exclude Peter from being the rock. Here we see a continuation of that passage from Origen's commentary on Matthew. Again, Origen is allegorically expanding upon the literal meaning of Peter being the rock that everyone already knew, saying that those who imitate Christ receive the surname of rock. But if we want to know what Origen thought about the rock of Matthew 16:18, we need to do our best to look at all his works to see how he refers to Peter. Both the quotes from his commentary on Matthew that we saw previously fit in with the Catholic position that the rock is Peter, but can also be used to allegorically refer to Christ or Christians generally. In his commentary on John, we see Origen explicitly say that the Church of Christ is built upon Peter, thus making Peter the rock. In his homilies on Exodus, Origen refers to Peter as the great foundation of the church and that most solid of rocks upon whom Christ built the church. Doesn't get any more clearer than that, I think. These are the statements of Origen that Peter is the rock that many Protestants are unaware of or neglect to cite and take into account. Moving on to Eusebius, I was able to verify at least one citation where he refers to the rock of the faith of Christ, which seems a little odd to refer to the faith of Christ as if Christ had faith. I was not able to verify another common Protestant citation of Eusebius's commentary on the Psalms, which also associates the rock with Christ. But anyway, these citations seem impressive at first, but has the Protestant looked at all his writings and at every way that Eusebius interprets Matthew 16:18? We need only look at another, more famous work of Eusebius to see he does not exclude Peter from being the rock. Here in Eusebius's church history, his most famous work, we see he clearly believes the Church of Christ was built on Peter, thus making Peter the rock. This is the statement of Eusebius that Peter is the rock that many Protestants are unaware of and neglect to cite and take into account. Interestingly, the context of this statement is the biblical canon of the New Testament, in which Eusebius says Peter left us one epistle, with a second one being doubtful. Statements like this gravely undermine Protestant claims about how the New Testament canon came about and came to be settled. It was not obvious to everyone that Peter's second letter was genuine and inspired. Speaking of controversy over the canon of Scripture, please check out my videos on the biblical canon, where I show the evidence for the larger Catholic biblical canon based on Jewish reception, early church usage, the universal acceptance of the North African councils throughout the worldwide church, and a timeline proof of how Jerome apparently changed his mind on the biblical canon a couple times, or at least softened his rejection of the Deuterocanon later in life. Here is the citation of Hilary of Poitiers that many Protestants will cite against the Catholic belief that Peter is the rock. In this passage, we see Hilary refers to the rock as Peter's confession and Peter's faith. Seems pretty impressive at first, but if the Protestant would just look at the primary source context for himself, he would notice something very interesting in the very same work, in the very same 6th book, just several passages earlier. In the very same work, in the same 6th book, just several passages earlier, we see Hilary saying that Simon Peter was set to be the foundation stone of the church. Like the Catholic Church, Hilary believes that the rock refers to both Peter himself and his confession of faith. This is the statement of Hilary that Peter is the rock that many Protestants are unaware of or neglect to cite and take into account. So much for Hilary being a witness to the non-Catholic position against Peter being the rock. If you're going to take exclusive claims or make exclusive claims like a particular church father believes the rock is not Peter but something else, you better do your due diligence to make sure that church father doesn't call Peter the rock elsewhere in his writings. Here we have another and even more egregious example of non-Catholics not going back to the primary source to double check the context. In this particular passage, Gregory of Nyssa refers to Peter's firm faith as the foundation of the church. To the lazy and sloppy, this might seem impressive and conclusive. But guess what Gregory of Nyssa says in the same passage of the same work just a little earlier? In the same passage of the same work just a little earlier, we find Gregory of Nyssa saying, Peter, the chief of the apostles, is recalled, and the remaining members of the church are glorified with him, for indeed the church of God is established upon him. This is in accord with the Lord's words, who made him the firm and most solid rock upon which he had built his church. And then he goes on to reference Matthew 16. This is the statement of Gregory of Nyssa that Peter is the rock, that many Protestants are unaware of and neglect to cite and take into account. So much for Gregory of Nyssa being a witness for the Protestant or Eastern Orthodox position on this topic. As with Hilary and Gregory of Nyssa, John Chrysostom is yet another example of how non-Catholics often fail to read the primary sources for themselves and do some due diligence to research how a father refers to Peter throughout their writings. Here in some homilies on Matthew and John, we see Chrysostom identifying the rock of Matthew 16 with the faith or confession of Peter. But by now, you should know that that's not the only way Chrysostom referred to the rock. If one merely reads an earlier homily on Matthew, and merely reads further on in that very same homily 54, we see Chrysostom referring to Peter as a foundation of the church and more solid than any rock. In another homily, he calls Peter the foundation of the faith and the base of the confession. In another work on almsgiving, he calls Peter an unbreakable rock and an immovable ridge. These are the statements of Chrysostom that Peter is the rock that many non-Catholics are unaware of and neglect to cite and take into account. So much for Chrysostom being a witness for the Protestant or Eastern Orthodox position on this topic. Our next witness is Ambrose of Milan. You might find some non-Catholics claiming that he believes the rock of Matthew 16 is only Peter's confession or faith. Here's one such passage they might point to support this, which emphasizes Peter's confession of faith. It should be pointed out that Catholicism also does not teach that it is Peter's flesh that is the rock that hell will not prevail against. That would be a straw man. However, if we just read the passage in context, we can see that it is not the case that Ambrose denies Peter to be the rock. If we read just a little before this excerpt, we can see that Ambrose calls Peter the foundation and says Peter knows how to preserve the common foundation of the church. So, in context, this particular excerpt affirms both Peter and his confession of faith, not just his confession of faith. In another work, Ambrose provides some prophetic commentary on this debate between Catholics and non-Catholics on whether Peter is the rock. He says, "Great is the grace of Christ, who has imparted almost all his own names to his disciples. I am," said he, "the light of the world. And yet with that very name in which he glories, he favored his disciples, saying, Ye are the light of the world. I am the living bread, and we are all one bread. Christ is the rock, for," and then he quotes 1 Corinthians 10:4, but then he says, "Also he denied not to his disciple the grace of this name," namely rock, that he should be Peter, because he has from the rock the solidity of constancy, the firmness of faith. And then he goes on to allegorize it in encouraging all Christians to be a rock and to make your faith your rock. So, even though Catholics would agree with Ambrose that Christ is the rock in the ultimate sense, Ambrose makes it clear that Christ is not jealous about names and titles and actually shares his own names with his disciples. I really think Ambrose would be puzzled and impatient with non-Catholics who are more jealous than Jesus of the title rock and who try to deny to Peter the title that his very name means. Let's wrap up our testimony from Ambrose with some clear, explicit statements from him that Peter is the rock of Matthew 16. In his work on the Christian faith, Ambrose uses a rhetorical question to assert that Christ calls Peter the rock, thereby declaring him to be the foundation of the church. Quoting the Petrine passages Luke 22:32 and Matthew 16:18, Ambrose also says Christ strengthens the faith of Peter and gave the kingdom to Peter. In another work, Ambrose quotes Matthew 16:18 as what Christ said to Peter and asserts that where Peter is, there is the church. But if Peter died in the first century, then where is the church after his death? The early church always gave the answer Rome, where the seat and authority of Peter lives on, as I showed in my video on whether Rome could lose its primacy. We come at last to the great Augustine. Now, I'm not going to bother quoting everything Augustine wrote on this topic of who or what the rock of Matthew 16 is, but I will start by quoting a couple popular passages that non-Catholics like to cherry pick and use against the idea of Peter being the rock. In this first citation, Homily 10 on 1 John, Augustine identifies the rock as the faith confessed by Peter. In Sermon 229p, we get perhaps the best citation non-Catholics can offer, since in it he says Christ built his church not on a man, but on Peter's confession. However, interestingly, even in this citation, it's important to notice that Augustine still clearly calls Peter the rock multiple times, with the translator emphasizing or clarifying this point from the Latin by saying in an endnote that he'll have to translate Peter as rocky. It's also worth pointing out that Augustine seems to be merely emphasizing the derivative nature of Peter as the rock. Peter is called rocky from Christ the rock, just as we are called Christians from Jesus' title, the Christ. So even here, we can say Augustine is saying the rock is not merely the human being Peter, but Peter elevated by Christ because of his confession. Also worth pointing out how Augustine echoes other church fathers in identifying the gates of Hades or the underworld with heretics and their prideful heresies. And in relation to the Christian sharing in the name and title of Christ or Messiah, he echoes Ambrose in saying that Christ is not jealous of his own names and titles, but shares them with his disciples. Because Augustine wrote so much, I think the best and most efficient thing to do is to go to Augustine's last finished work, Retractationes, sometimes called retractions or revisions or corrections in English. In this work, he looks back over his prior writings and offers additional thoughts, and this topic is one of the ones he covers. Augustine says that earlier on in his writings, he said Peter was the rock the church was built on, echoing a song of Ambrose that expresses the same idea. And so Augustine here gives us even more evidence that Ambrose believed Peter was the rock, and not just Christ or Peter's faith. But then Augustine says later he frequently explained the rock to be Christ. Interestingly, he doesn't mention anything here about Peter's faith or confession, just Peter and Christ. He concludes the topic by implicitly saying both interpretations are equally valid, saying, let the reader decide which of these two opinions is the more probable. So he does that rather than imposing one rigid interpretation. But before we wrap up Augustine, let's look at some passages where he clearly associates Peter with being the rock. In a work against the Donatists, Augustine says the seat or chair of Peter in the Petrine succession of popes, itself associated with that chair, is itself the rock that cannot be conquered and thus cannot lose its primacy and authority. And in case there's any doubt, in another passage we clearly see that Augustine affirms that it is the Roman Church that possesses the Petrine succession and thus Peter's seat or chair. This is a powerful testimony from the most revered and prolific early church father to the indefectibility of the papal successors to Peter in Rome, especially when we remember he considered the gates of Hades to be heresies and heretics. Lastly, in letter 53, Augustine discusses the Petrine succession of bishops at Rome and the certainty and benefit it gives to the church, quoting Matthew 16:18. And as I show in my video on Paul's rebuke of Peter, Augustine did not believe that the sin or scandal of church leaders took away their authority, even if a traitor to the church had obtained the papal throne. In fact, he says that the Lord provided for such a case concerning wicked clergy, appealing to Matthew 23, which references the seat of Moses and affirms the authority of religious leaders, even as the faithful are to reject and not imitate their leaders' sinful and scandalous behavior. Augustine reaffirms the stability of Peter and his successors at Rome being fixed in the Lord and thus not being able to be swept away, which evokes the parable of Matthew 7 with the two houses built on rock and sand. In this context, we can see Augustine says the rock is not Peter the man merely to emphasize Christ's providence of stability in Peter and his successors. In that case, the rock includes the Roman succession of bishops.